Have you ever been replaced in your own family so slowly that by the time you realized it, there was nothing left to replace? 6 weeks ago, my father stood in the living room of the house I grew up in, surrounded by the people who supposedly loved him most, and announced that he was transferring control of the Callaway Family Medical Foundation to my younger brother. Not because my brother was more qualified, not because he'd earned it, but because, according to my father, he was the future of this family's legacy. I was sitting 3 feet away when he said it. My name is Serena Callaway. I'm 32 years old and I've been a hospice nurse for 9 years. I hold my patients' hands when they die. I call their families at 2 in the morning when something changes. I've worked holidays, weekends, double shifts in facilities that smelled like antiseptic and grief, and I have never once regretted it. My father is Dr. Leonard Callaway, retired cardiologist, founding donor of the Callaway Family Medical Foundation, a nonprofit that funds nursing scholarships and equipment grants for rural healthcare clinics across the Southeast. He spent his entire career telling anyone who would listen that nurses were the backbone of medicine, until his second wife convinced him that backbone didn't mean legacy. This didn't start 6 weeks ago. It started the year my mother died, and the year after that when my father stopped being the man I thought he was. My mother's name was Frances. She was a labor and delivery nurse for 22 years. She had a laugh you could hear from the other side of the house and a habit of collecting ceramic owls she found at estate sales. She died of pancreatic cancer when I was 11, and the whole thing from diagnosis to funeral was 4 months. I barely had time to understand what was happening before she was gone. My father didn't speak for 3 days after the funeral. He sat in his recliner in the den and stared at the wall, and my aunt had to come stay with us because he couldn't make breakfast. I understood that. I was 11, but I understood grief. I'd seen it in hospital waiting rooms my whole childhood, watching my mother come home from shifts and explain to me, gently, that some families got bad news today. What I didn't understand was what came next. 14 months after my mother died, my father introduced us to a woman named Sylvia. She was the administrative director of his cardiology group. She had a son from her first marriage, a 14-year-old named Preston, who wore boat shoes indoors and never once made eye contact with me at the dinner table. My father said she made him feel like himself again. I was 12. I said okay, because what else was I going to say? Sylvia moved in 6 months after that. She didn't redecorate aggressively, she just quietly reorganized. My mother's ceramic owls ended up in a box in the garage. The quilt my grandmother made was folded into a storage bin. The family photos in the hallway got rotated. Some of them were replaced with framed pictures from Sylvia and Preston's previous life, a ski trip, a birthday party, a beach vacation my father hadn't been on. When I was 15, I asked my father if we could put some of Mom's photos back up. He said, "Serena, we have to look forward." That was the first time I understood that looking forward in my father's house meant looking away from me. I won't say my father was cruel. He wasn't. He showed up to my high school graduation. He paid for my nursing degree without complaint. He told me he was proud of me exactly twice that I can remember. Once when I passed my boards, and once when I got hired at Briar Ridge Hospice Center. But pride in our house had an expiration date. It lasted about a week before the conversation shifted back to Preston. Preston was pre-med. Then Preston was in medical school. Then Preston matched at a prestigious residency program in Atlanta. Every milestone was announced at the dinner table like a ticker tape parade, and every time I'd glance over and catch Sylvia smiling at my father with this look, this very specific look, like she was handing him something he'd always wanted. I've been a hospice nurse for 9 years. I have a certification in palliative care. I served on the advisory board for Briar Ridge's Quality Improvement Committee. I wrote and submitted the grant application that funded our new patient family lounge. I have, in the last 4 years alone, been present for 114 deaths and held the hands of more families in crisis than I can count. None of this came up at dinner. The foundation had been in the background of my life for as long as I could remember. My father created it after my mother died, nominally in her honor, though Sylvia had been involved in its governance almost from the beginning. It funds nursing scholarships at 3 community colleges in Alabama and Georgia, equipment grants for rural clinics, and a small residency stipend program for nurses who want to specialize in palliative care. It mattered to me. It mattered because my mother was a nurse, and because the kind of work I do every day was exactly what the foundation claimed to exist for. I found out Preston was being named to the board from a forwarded email. Not a call, not a conversation over dinner, a forwarded email. My aunt, my father's sister, sent it to me with a single line at the top. Did you know about this? I hadn't. The email was a draft announcement, clearly in the late stages of finalization, with the subject line, Callaway Foundation Board Transition, New Appointment. It named Preston as incoming associate director of the board, effective following a donor celebration dinner, to be held at the Fairmont in Birmingham in 3 weeks. I called my father immediately. He answered on the third ring, and when I told him I'd seen the email, he went quiet for a second, the way he does when he's deciding how to frame something. "Serena," he said, "Preston has a medical degree. He understands the clinical side in a way that will be valuable to the foundation." "I'm a nurse, Dad. I've worked in palliative care for 9 years. The foundation funds nursing scholarships and palliative care stipends. I understand the clinical side." "This isn't a competition." "I'm not making it one. I'm asking why you didn't talk to me about this." Another pause. "We'll discuss it at the dinner. It'll make more sense in context." I wanted to ask what context would make sense of leaving me out entirely, but I'd had enough conversations with my father to know that pushing too hard in that moment would just cause him to get formal and distant, to treat me like a difficult meeting he had to manage. "Fine," I said. "We'll discuss it at the dinner." My husband Malcolm had been listening from the doorway of the kitchen. He's not a man who talks over things. He waits until he's seen the whole picture. "Say it," I told him after I hung up. "Who runs the foundation's grant program right now?" "Sylvia coordinates it. She's been on the board since the beginning." He nodded. "And Preston has no clinical background in anything the foundation actually funds." "No, he did a cardiology residency. He's in private practice." "Okay." He said it the way he says things when he's decided something. "Can I make some calls this week?" "About what?" "About who actually funds the foundation." I told him he could, and then I made the mistake of not asking what he was planning. Over the next 3 weeks, I noticed things. Malcolm staying late in his home office, legal pads covered in notes on his desk, a phone call I wasn't meant to overhear where I caught the words partnership compliance and board composition requirements. I asked him once what he was researching. "Just want to understand the full picture before we walk in there," he said. I let it go. I had enough to manage just getting myself ready to walk into that room. The dinner was on a Friday night, the Fairmont Ballroom in Birmingham, 80 guests, mostly foundation donors, a few colleagues of my father's, some representatives from the community colleges the foundation partnered with. I hadn't been on the planning committee. I'd received a printed invitation in the mail, 3rd class, addressed to Serena Callaway and guest. Not Dr. and Mrs. Not even Serena Callaway Adair. Just Serena Callaway Adair. Just Serena Callaway. My married name wasn't on it. Malcolm noticed. He didn't say anything. We arrived to find that our table was near the back of the room, close to the AV booth. Table 11. The donor tables were 1 through 4. Family was supposed to be at table 2. My father's table. Preston was at table 2. I was at table 11. I stood in front of the seating chart for a moment longer than I should have. A woman I didn't recognize appeared beside me, glanced at the chart, then at me. "Are you Serena?" "Jonathan's daughter. I'm one of the board members. I wasn't sure you'd be coming." "I was invited," I said. She smiled awkward and moved on quickly. Malcolm took my hand and we walked to table 11. Dinner began with remarks from the foundation's executive director, a woman named Dr. Harriet Voss, who'd been with the organization for 12 years. She talked about impact numbers, scholarships funded, clinics served. She was warm and specific and clearly believed in the work. Then my father stood. He looked good. He always looks good at these things, confident in the way that people who spent decades being the most important person in a room learn to carry themselves. He thanked the donors. He talked about the foundation's growth. He talked about legacy, about what it means to build something that outlives you. Then he looked at Preston and smiled, the smile I'd spent my whole childhood trying to earn. "I've always believed that the best legacies are ones built with family," he said. "Tonight I'm proud to announce that my son Preston will be joining the Foundation's board as Associate Director. Preston brings clinical expertise and a deep commitment to the values this foundation was founded on." Preston stood. Applause. My father raised his glass. "To the next generation of the Calloway legacy." Everyone drank. I held my glass and didn't. Then my father looked at table 11, directly at me. The room was still warm from the applause. His expression shifted, just slightly. Something that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite apology, just discomfort. The look of a man who has made a decision and doesn't want to be questioned about it in public. "I know tonight isn't easy for everyone," he said. The microphone was still in his hand. His voice was still projecting. "Some paths lead here." He gestured vaguely at the room. "Others lead elsewhere, and I've made peace with that." There it was. Not, "You can leave," but close enough, an erasure delivered in the passive voice the way my father always delivered hard things, politely, professionally, with just enough ambiguity that I couldn't quote it back to him. Except that he said it into a microphone, in front of 80 people, at least a dozen of whom were looking at me. I felt my face go very still, the way it goes when I'm in a patient's room and there's nothing left to do but hold the space. I didn't stand up, not yet. Then Malcolm stood. He didn't push his chair back hard. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood, straightened his jacket and said, "Dr. Calloway, I think we should talk about the board appointment before this evening goes any further." My father blinked. "I'm sorry, and you are." Malcolm Adair, Serena's husband. He walked toward the front of the room. Not fast, not aggressive, just with the particular calm of a man who has done a lot of walking into rooms where people didn't expect him. "This is a private celebration," my father said. "It's a foundation event with donors present," Malcolm said. "And I have some concerns about compliance that I think Dr. Voss and your major donors will want to hear." Dr. Voss had gone still at her seat near table 1. She was watching Malcolm with an expression I'd come to recognize over the years, someone running calculations. Malcolm reached the front of the room. He glanced at my father, then turned to address the room. "My name is Malcolm Adair. I'm the Regional Director of the Southeastern Healthcare Philanthropy Network, which is a consortium of grant-making foundations that funds healthcare nonprofits across 6 states. He paused. "The Calloway Foundation has been a partner organization in our network since 2019. My father's expression shifted. Something flickered in it that I hadn't seen before. "As a partner organization," Malcolm continued, "the Calloway Foundation agreed to a set of governance standards that govern how its board appointments are made. Dr. Voss is familiar with these. She signed the 2022 renewal." Dr. Voss closed her eyes briefly. She knew. "Specifically," Malcolm said, "Section 6.2 of the Partnership Agreement requires that any new board appointments to organizations receiving SHPN funding must demonstrate a minimum of 5 years of direct clinical service in a field relevant to the organization's stated mission." He let that sit. "The Calloway Foundation's stated mission is to support nursing education and palliative care access in underserved communities." He turned toward Preston. "Preston Calloway is a cardiologist in private practice. He has 0 years of experience in nursing, palliative care, or underserved rural health care." Preston's face went red. "Is that accurate?" Malcolm asked. No one answered. Meanwhile, Malcolm said, "Serena Calloway Adair has 9 years of hospice and palliative care nursing. She holds a palliative care certification. She has served on a clinical quality committee. She has personally written and secured grant funding for patient care programs." He looked at my father. "She has every qualification Section 6.2 requires." And she wasn't asked. The room was absolutely silent. Before I stood up, I did something the original story didn't give its narrator enough room to do. I stood up first. Before Malcolm could finish his next sentence, I pushed back my chair and I walked to the front of that room and I spoke. I've been a hospice nurse for 9 years, I said. I've sat with patients at the end of their lives and held space for their families in the worst moments they will ever have. I have done this work because my mother was a nurse and because I believe it matters, even when nobody is watching, even when it doesn't come with a title or an announcement at a dinner. My voice didn't shake. I'd learned a long time ago how to keep my voice steady when the room needed steadiness. This foundation was built in my mother's memory. She was a labor and delivery nurse for 22 years. Her name was Frances. I don't know if that still means anything in this room, but it means everything to me. I looked at my father. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not anger, not dismissal, something older and harder to name. I'm not here to take anything away from Preston, but I'm done being overlooked in rooms where my experience is directly relevant and my presence is an afterthought. I stepped back. Malcolm stepped forward. Dr. Voss, he said, this is the situation. Section 6.2 has been violated by the appointment as announced. If it stands, the Callaway Foundation will be in breach of its SHPN partnership agreement, which puts approximately $340,000 in annual grant funding at risk, including the 3 nursing scholarship cohorts currently in progress. He pulled out his phone. I have a formal notice of concern drafted. I was planning to send it Monday morning. I can send it right now, or we can resolve this tonight. Dr. Voss stood. She'd been in nonprofit governance long enough to know that $340,000 in grant funding was not a symbolic number. That was real scholarships. Real nurses. Leonard, she said quietly to my father, we need to address this. My father looked at Sylvia. Sylvia looked at Preston. Preston was staring at the tablecloth. I wasn't told about any clause, my father said. His voice had lost some of its confidence. You signed the 2019 partnership agreement, Malcolm said, and the 2022 renewal? Sylvia handles the administrative. Leonard, Dr. Voss's voice was firm. Stop. The room had shifted. I could feel it. The donors were no longer watching my father with admiration. They were watching him the way people watch someone who has just revealed something they can't take back. A woman from one of the community college partnerships stood up from table 3. Is the scholarship funding actually at risk? Yes, Malcolm said. If the appointment stands and we proceed to the next grant cycle in February, SHPN will have no choice but to flag the breach. The woman sat down and immediately started typing on her phone. Sylvia stood. This is completely inappropriate. This is a family matter being dragged into a professional. You made it professional, I said, and I said it directly to her clearly in front of everyone. When you coordinated a foundation board announcement at a donor dinner and didn't tell the one family member whose entire career is in the foundation's mission area, you made it professional. When you forwarded the announcement email to the board without including me in a single conversation, you made it professional. I hadn't planned to say that. It came out the way things come out when you've been holding them for 20 years. Sylvia sat back down. Malcolm turned to Dr. Voss. Here's what I'm asking for. 3 things. Rescind the appointment as announced tonight. Initiate a proper board nomination process that complies with Section 6.2. And acknowledge, publicly and on the record, that Serena meets the qualifications the Foundation's mission requires. Dr. Voss looked at my father for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Leonard, she said, I need your answer. My father stood at the front of a room he'd hosted 100 times, in front of people who'd believed in him for decades, and for the first time I watched him look small. Yes, he said finally, we'll follow the process. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't the phone call at 2 a.m. where he explained himself, and I listened and we found our way to something real. It was just a man choosing the least damaging option in a room full of witnesses. But it was something. Malcolm and I walked back to table 11 together. We didn't leave through the service corridor. We walked through the center of that room, past the donor tables, past the podium, and out through the main entrance. I didn't look back at my father. He told me what I needed to know when he looked at table 11 and given me that polite, ambiguous dismissal into a live microphone. Some things don't need a second reading. Preston resigned from the board position 2 days later, before it was ever formally recorded. He sent me a text that said, "I didn't know about the clause. I'm sorry." I believed him about the clause. I was less certain about the rest. My father called me a week later. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to it 3 times in my car in the parking lot of Briar Ridge before I went in for my shift. He said he wanted to talk. He said he'd gotten some things wrong. He said he'd been thinking about Frances, my mother, more than he had in years. I called him back. We met for coffee at a place equidistant between his house and mine, a neutral corner, public, nothing at stake scenically. He brought a photo. I hadn't asked him to, he just brought it. My mother in her scrubs, standing in front of the labor and delivery ward at Mercy Regional, smiling at the camera with that smile that looked like she knew something good was about to happen. He set it on the table between us. Her name was Frances Marie Calloway, he said, his voice cracked slightly on Marie. That was the first time I'd heard him say her full name out loud since her funeral. We talked for almost an hour. He tried to explain things, the grief, the years of distance, the way Sylvia had become the architecture of his life before he'd noticed how much she'd been renovating. I listened without interrupting. I didn't absolve him. I just listened, the way I'd been trained to listen, the way my mother probably taught me without ever meaning to, sitting with what's being said without trying to fix it. When he finished, I told him that I didn't need him to rewrite the last 20 years. I wasn't asking for that. What I needed was for him to see what I'd built, not what he'd wanted me to build. The work I did every day, the patients I sat with, the families I helped through the worst moments of their lives, that wasn't a lesser path. That was the path my mother would have understood completely. He nodded. He didn't have a ready answer. That was probably the most honest he'd been with me in a decade. "I'd like to try," I said. "Dinner once a month, maybe. I'm not your redemption story, but you're still my father, and I'm still your daughter, and maybe that's worth something if we're careful with it." He said yes. I left first. That mattered to me. The foundation board ran a formal nomination process 6 weeks later. I submitted my qualifications and a written statement. Dr. Voss called me the following Tuesday. "You're the only applicant who meets Section 6.2 in full," she said. The vote was unanimous. I've been on the board for 3 months now. My first initiative is a proposal to expand the palliative care stipend program to cover rural home health nurses, the ones who drive an hour each way to sit with patients who have no one else. Nobody told them their work was a legacy. Nobody announced it at a dinner. They just showed up the way my mother showed up, the way I show up. That's what I think about when people ask me what the foundation does. Malcolm brings lunch to my office on Tuesdays now. We sit in the break room and he tells me about his grant cycle, and I tell him about my patients, not by name, never by name, but by the particular weight of what they carry. He listens the same way he always has, like time isn't a limited resource. The photo of my mother is on my desk at Briar Ridge. Frances in her scrubs, standing in front of the labor ward, smiling like she knows something good is coming. I used to keep it in my car. Too personal for the desk, I'd always thought too tender. I put it on the desk the morning after the donor dinner. It belongs in the open. Some legacies don't get announced at galas. They don't get plaques or standing ovations or lines in a speech. They get built slowly, quietly, in rooms that smell like antiseptic and fresh coffee, and the particular stillness of early morning hospital shifts. My mother built one. I'm building one. That's enough. More than enough. And I don't need anyone's permission to know it. The morning after the donor dinner, I sat in my car in the Briar Ridge parking lot for 6 minutes before going in for my shift. Not because I was falling apart, because I needed to feel the quiet before the day started. I kept thinking about something my mother used to say when I was small, that the people who show up in the hard rooms are the ones who actually believe the work matters. She meant nurses. She meant herself. I didn't understand it fully until I was the one showing up. What happened at that dinner wasn't random. My father spent years making choices, small ones mostly, quiet redirections that accumulated into something structural. He let my mother's name disappear from the house. He let Sylvia reorganize what mattered and what didn't. He chose the easier path every time there was a moment where he could have chosen differently. And those choices built the room I walked into that night, the table in the back, the invitation that had the wrong last name, the speech that erased me without ever saying my name. I think about cause and effect a lot in my work. In hospice care, you see it clearly. The decades of cigarettes, the years of untreated stress, the relationships left unrepaired. By the time someone is in my care, the long chain of choices has already run its course. My job isn't to undo any of that. My job is to be present for what's true right now. My father built consequences. He just didn't see them coming because Sylvia kept the paperwork tidy and the dinner invitations went out on time. What I know is this: I didn't survive that room because I was lucky, or because Malcolm happened to be prepared. I survived it because of 9 years of learning how to hold steady when the situation is hard and the outcome is uncertain. That's not a skill you're born with. It's something you build by showing up to difficult rooms over and over until the steadiness becomes part of who you are. Every shift I worked when I was exhausted, every family meeting where I had to deliver news nobody wanted, every morning I drove to a facility that smelled like the end of things and chose to walk in anyway, that was me building something. I just didn't know I was also building toward that ballroom. And the integrity piece matters more than I used to give it credit for. I could have spent years making noise about what I wasn't getting. I could have lobbied for recognition, positioned myself, played the game the way Preston played it. I didn't. Not because I was passive, but because I genuinely believed the work was worth doing, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. That belief turned out to be the thing nobody could take away from me. Not the seating chart. Not the announcement. Not my father's carefully worded dismissal into a live microphone. My mother's photo is on my desk now. Frances in her scrubs, standing in front of the labor ward, smiling like she already knows how it ends. I think she'd understand all of it. The long way around, the table in the back, the moment I finally stood up and said her name in a room full of people who had forgotten it. That's the part I want to carry forward. Not the drama of the evening, not the clause, not the $340,000. Just the fact that I said her name out loud, in a room that was supposed to erase her, and the room had to listen.